Hello all, welcome to SSGuruCool. In today's section, we will talk about the various processes under the knowledge area, scope management. So, there are around 6 processes under this knowledge area, scope management. And in this part 1 of scope management, we will be covering the first 3 processes. Before getting into the individual processes, let us talk a little about scope. So, what is scope management? Scope management is the process of managing the work that's needed to be executed for accomplishing the project and identifying only the work that needed to be carried out to complete the project. Now, the scope can be classified into 2 types. One is called as the product scope, the other one is called as a project scope. Now, the product scope is nothing but the features and the attributes of a product which you are trying to develop. And the project scope is nothing but the work that needs to be done to achieve the product scope. So, when you talk about managing scope, what you basically do first is you will plan as to how to go about this entire aspect of scope, that is plan for scope, and then you go about collecting the requirements. And then from the requirements you refine the scope, and then you actually kind of break down that scope into manageable components, and then you go about executing them. And once the work is executed, you go and confirm it with the stakeholders whether what you have done is as per their expectations and get their formal acceptance. And this entire processes you keep and monitor and control the scope. So basically these are all the activities that are undergone. So there are 6 processes under the scope management. The first one is plan scope management. Second is collect requirements. Third is define scope. Fourth is create WBS or work breakdown structure. And fifth is validate scope. And 6th is monitor and control scope. Of the 6 processes which we saw, but for one, all other process names are self-explanatory in terms of what the processes are trying to achieve. But validate scope is a little tricky. So in validate scope, you actually go and show your deliverable to the customer, and then based on the acceptance criteria that were agreed early on, you try to get a sign off from the customer as to whether the deliverable has been delivered in the way customer wants. So the validate scope is a little tricky. So we saw the 6 processes. Of these, 4 of them, that is plan scope management, collect requirements, define scope, and create WBS. These 4 comes under the planning process group. And the other 2, that is validate scope and monitor and control scope, becomes a part of the monitoring and control process group. Now we will get into each of these processes in a little more detail. From now on, what I will be doing is, I'll be not talking about all the inputs, tools and techniques and the outputs of a process. First process we will be seeing in the scope management knowledge area is the plan scope management process. The inputs for this processes are project management plan, project charter, enterprise environmental factor, and organizational process assets. We have already seen the details of project management plan, enterprise environmental factors, and organizational process assets in the previous video. Project charter will be dealt in detail as a part of the integration knowledge area. Coming to the tools and techniques, the tools and techniques that are used in these processes are expert judgment, meetings, and data analysis. The output of these processes are scope management plan and requirements management plan. Some of the highlights of this process is it is the process of creating the scope management plan, a document that states how a scope will be defined, validated, and controlled. It also is the process of creating requirements management plan, a document that states
how requirement will be analyzed, documented and managed. The scope management plan actually reduces the risk of scope creep.
Just now saw what are the inputs, tools and techniques and the output of plan scope management. You also saw a little about some of the key highlights of the process. Alternative analysis or alternate analysis. Now the alternate analysis is a process of identifying various alternates methods of going about things or achieving the objectives, and then evaluating those objectives for the feasibilities and the other components like cost, risk, etc., and thereby making a decision on how to go about the project. So this process is called as alternative analysis, and alternative analysis, which is a part of the data analysis, is a key tool and technique for defining or planning the scope management. So the scope management plan is one of the key output of this process, plan scope management. So the scope management is a document that would talk about how we go about defining the scope, monitoring the scope and controlling the scope, and more importantly how we will be also getting the scope accepted. The requirement management plan is a document that talks about how the requirements from the customer would be collected, how would it be analyzed, how will it be documented, and how will it be tracked across the life cycle of the projects, etc. So there is a difference between a requirement and the scope. Now requirement is defined by the stakeholders, and the scope is defined by the project team. The accepted requirements become the scope. So basically there are two management plans. One is the scope management plan, the other one is the requirement management plan.
The second process which we are going to look at is collect requirements. Now the inputs for collect requirements are project charter, project management plan, project documents, business documents, agreements, enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets. Tools and techniques. The tools and techniques list is pretty exhaustive for this process. They are data gathering, data analysis, decision making, data representation, interpersonal and team skills, expert judgment, prototypes and context diagrams. Output. The outputs are requirement documentation and requirement traceability matrix. Some of the highlights of this process. The project success is actually directly influenced by the care taken in capturing and managing the project and product requirements. The requirements actually becomes the foundation of work breakdown structure. Now this is a very important point. Scope is not the foundation of work breakdown structure, but requirement is actually the foundation of work breakdown structure. Requirements can be classified into various types. Business requirements, solution requirements in terms of functional or non-functional. It can be transition requirements, project requirements, quality requirements, etc. etc.
Just now we saw the various inputs, tools and techniques, and the outputs of collect requirements process. Now one of the key tools and technique was data gathering. Now data gathering, there are various sub sections in this data gathering techniques, or various techniques that are available under this data gathering techniques. Number one is brainstorming session. Now brainstorming is a session where people are allowed to speak without any bias. The key word is listen to the people without any bias. One such other technique is called as the interview. Now interview can be one-on-one, one-to-many or many-to-one. Basically you ask questions, open questions, closed questions based on the type of information you want to gather. Now the third one is called as the focus group. A focus group is a discussion among pre-qualified participants from similar function. Basically focus groups are used for deep diving. So the key word for focus group is similar function team members. Next one is questionnaires and surveys. Now questionnaires and surveys techniques are used when you want to cover the a large amount of stakeholder base, and the cost available is pretty less, and also the time is very less. So it is a very cost effective and very wide in terms of the reach, but accuracy might be a concern. And lastly, what we have is benchmarking. Benchmarking is nothing but you compare whatever you have collected, or you collect the data and then you compare it to the industry norms or the particular best business practices that are available, and then basically identify the gap, and then from there you move on to what needs to be done to improve or to work on the gap. So to repeat, the data gathering techniques are brainstorming, interviews, focus group workshop, surveys and questionnaires, and brainstorming. The next tool which we are going to talk, the key tool and technique which we are going to talk about is the decision making. Now, decision making is again of many technique types. The ones which we will look in here are voting techniques, and then autocratic decision making, and lastly the multi-criteria decision analysis. Voting. Some of the voting scenarios that can be applicable are unanimity, majority, and plurality. For example, if there are 100 people and all 100 of them agree, it is unanimous. If there are 100 people, out of which 60 people agree to A and 40 people agree to B, A is selected based on majority. Now, in case of there are 100 stakeholders and then 45 agree to one, and then 30 to another, and 25 to another, the one with 45 is selected. Plurality, wherein no option is having the majority. Autocratic is generally a technique which is used when the time available is very less, or the people participating in the decision making processes are quite new to the decision process and hence are not able to decide, or when it comprises a team of junior. Not necessarily that autocratic decisions are bad. Multi-criteria decision analysis is an analytical approach to the decision making process. One another tool and technique which is very important is called as a data representation. Now, data representations is a very elaborate topic, but we will look into two of the major ones. One is called as the affinity diagram. The other one is called as the mind mapping. Now, affinity diagram is where all the ideas which have been collected are grouped into buckets based on the similarity. So you basically converge towards the common picture. So it is convergent approach. Now, the mind mapping is a technique wherein the core idea forms the core of the mind map, and then from there ideas fan out. So basically, mind map is more of a divergent technique to look at options, to look at alternates, etc. Another technique is interpersonal and team skills. Now, on these, this again is a very elaborate topic, but the ones which are very relevant for scope are: number one, nominal group technique, wherein the ideas generated through the brainstormings are assigned ranks, and then based on the ranking, the ideas are arranged. Observations, wherein you basically observe or talk to people and then see what they are trying to do. This is used when the users are not able to express what is their requirement. Now, observation types can be of active type and passive type. In a passive type, you basically observe what the people are doing, and in active type, you basically see what people are doing and then you repeat, so that when you do the things, you probably have much more understanding. In addition to the two earlier ones, the next one is called as the facilitations or facilitated workshop techniques. Now, facilitated workshop is nothing but a team of cross-functional team members discussing the entire requirements from various point of views. So basically, the keyword is cross-functional team. Now, this facilitated workshops operate in different types of names in different industries. For example, you have JAD or Joint Application Development in IT industry, Quality Function Deployment or QFDs in manufacturing industries, or user stories in an agile or an iterative project environment. There is also something called as a prototype. A prototype is nothing but a tangible or a workable proof of concept or a miniature deliverable which we try to build to get confirmation from users on our understanding of the requirements. Context diagrams. Context diagrams are pretty unique. Context diagrams talks about the various systems in the solution and how they talk to each other. And here the people are also represented as systems. Now that we have seen the key tools and techniques, we will also look at some of the key outputs. Now, the number one key output of collect requirements is the requirement document. Requirement document talks about the individual requirements and the project objective. The requirements should be unambiguous, traceable, and acceptable to the key stakeholders. The requirements can be classified into various requirements as system requirements, functional requirements, legal requirements, etc. etc. Now, please note that the requirement documents also will have the constraints, dependencies, and assumptions listed under them. Now, assumptions are those statements which are assumed to be true unless proved otherwise. One another key output of the collect requirement process is the requirement traceability matrix. In requirement traceability matrix, so it starts with the requirement, and then as and when the scope and then the deliverables etc. are further elaborated, those traceability linkages are also attached to this document, and thereby each and every activity in a project will be able to assign to an requirement or should be alignable to one particular requirement from the stakeholders.